You're here, you read a little bit about what we want to do tonight. The topic is intimate dilemmas in the climate crisis, grief, kids, and feelings about the future. This brings a lot of the deeper sentiments of what it means to be living in the climate crisis era to our minds, to our heart. All right, so I'm going to introduce our wonderful panelists, and then I'm going to do a few more like contextual setting slides, and then we're going to bop into the panel. So I'm joined tonight, very grateful for their presence, powerful makers, thinkers, doers, shakers in the climate space. First, we have Annaïse Heglar, who's the Director of Publications at the National Resources Defense Council. Hey, Mary. And an independent climate justice essayist who has incredibly powerful writings out there on the internet that you should check out by following her on Twitter. Jade Begay. So let's bring up Jade. Can we bring up Jade on the screen? Hey, Jade, can you hear us, and can you please activate? Hey, wonderful. Hi, Jade. So Jade is joining us remotely, and Jade is a filmmaker and VR producer, Jade Begay. She's an Indigenous rights and climate justice activist working in multiple platforms for impact storytelling. We have also Josephine Ferorelli, who's co-founder of Conceivable Future, a grassroots women-led network bringing awareness to the threat that climate change poses to reproductive justice. And lastly, we have Matthew Schneider-Mayerson, who's assistant professor of environmental studies at Yale-NUS College, all the way here from Singapore today. And he's the author of Peak Oil, Apocalyptic Environmentalism and Libertarian Political Culture. And right now he's writing his next book, which is very on point for tonight because it's about the politics and ethics of reproductive choices in the climate change era. All right, so we'll come back to you guys in a moment. Thank you. So just as a brief cross-section of the issues we want to talk about tonight, whether it's, leaning into the idea that the hottest 20 years on record occurred within the last 22, or you've just read the latest UN, World Bank, whoever estimate about how many hundreds of millions of climate refugees we can expect by mid-century, there's an emotional toll to dealing with this information. And we want to be able to process that together in a few different ways tonight, let alone being directly impacted. So we do have an increasing amount of good data that shows us what happens when people live through traumatic, direct impact climate events, hurricanes, wildfires, droughts, you name it. And so epidemiologists, psychologists are weighing in, showing us that we have things like increased PTSD and suicidality, strained relationships, substance abuse, the list goes on for various forms of psychological distress that we're coming to understand very clearly. Now, what we understand a little bit less clearly, but is starting to enter the mix too, is this slower creeping form of distress that perhaps a lot of people in the room have already had some experience with, which is a form of grief and anxiety that comes with imagining future trauma, as well as dealing with the changes already observed. The climate psychiatrist Lise Van Susteren coined the term pre-traumatic stress to talk about the chronic condition in which you are imagining the future and you can't extricate yourself from it, and that future is distressing as a result of what you expect. Another way of talking about it might be to say anticipatory grief, ways that people are processing the anxieties that come with thinking about and doing frontline work in the climate crisis. We also have an increasing amount of knowledge around a phenomenon like solastalgia. So this is the sense of feeling homesick when you're actually in your home. And because your home has changed so much that it's no longer recognizable. And a strong case in point comes from a variety of Inuit communities living in Labrador, Canada, who work with Ashley Wilcox Consolo over the last decade to document how in that Arctic Circle region where the ice is vanishing, that impacts the sense of identity and a loss of identity and a form of ecological grief that comes when you are people of the ice and the ice is no longer there in predictable ways. So these are just a few ways into the idea. But for all of us here also, to kind of compound this, the American Psychological Association says that our responses mentally to climate change, such as fatalism, fear, conflict avoidance, helplessness, resignation, these qualities, if you can call them that, are growing. And this is not good, because these are the mechanisms that hold us back from being able to do the deep work that's needed to address the baseline issues that cause climate change and then work on solutions. And so that's another hope of trying to foster these communities where we can help combat these types of things in our own lives. So I'm a science storyteller, make different media projects about science, and I'm writing a book right now about the psychological impacts of living in a warming world. And a political scientist who I met along the way, Thomas Homer Dixon, said, a leading indicator that climate change is starting to hit home psychologically would be an increase in the rate of informed women deciding to not have children. Of course, it's not only women, but it does seem that we are at that point. Many of you may have had articles like this flow across your desk in the last year. They've really ramped up. Major media covering a phenomenon whereby particularly young people, but also folks of all generations, are thinking that it might not be a great idea to have kids at this time because of climate change. You may have seen Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talking about it in Instagram stories, saying that climate change presents young people with a legitimate question, that being, is it still okay to have kids? You may have even seen it in People magazine or something, that celebs like Miley Cyrus come out and say that they refuse to have children until climate change is dealt with because she will not pass that on to any child of hers. It's getting mainstream, and it's happening quickly. You may have seen Birth Strike, a movement, a political movement that cropped up only a few months ago out of the UK, where the undersigned members of this group declared that they refuse to have children because of the state of the existential threat of climate change and inaction from governments to address it. And for them, it's a form of rebellion. They're saying, we don't want to go on with life as usual, obeying the way that the state systems want us to. We're going to rebel, and this is the way. It's through functioning reproductively. So, before Birth Strike, there was Conceivable Future. And we will hear a lot more of that from Josephine tonight. Who throw these incredible house parties, safe spaces where people come together to process their emotions around how climate change connects to reproductive choices. And they frame it through the lens of reproductive justice, which is a concept that was created in the mid-90s by women of color in Chicago, particularly Loretta Ross and the Sister Song Collective, who talked about how reproductive justice needs to be much more than just access to abortion and healthcare. Reproductive justice means making sure that the environment in which your said children are supposed to grow up in is safe to grow up in. That you're not next to a waste plant or in an environmental toxic zone. That the water is safe to drink, that the air is good to breathe. And it's an all-encompassing environmental lens on reproductive justice. So Josephine will tell us more about how that works. Now, just to quickly flag here, in the conversations around reproductive hesitancy in our moment now with climate change, a lot of journalists quickly go to these papers that have been passed around many times, which have tallied up the kind of carbon footprint impact of having a child. So these are adaptations from a couple of those papers. One shows that if you're in an industrialized nation, on average, having one less child can help you save roughly 59 tons of carbon dioxide per year. Whereas, if you're looking at individualized choices, living car-free only saves about 2.5 tons per year. Avoiding one round-trip transatlantic flight can save nearly 1.5 tons per year. And eating a plant-based diet saves almost 1 ton per year. So this is the kind of logic that you can see appearing, not that we're advocating for it, but I want to cover the baselines of how people factor in children as a footprint measurement. Another way is from a separate paper that shows how this is actually extremely unequally distributed depending on where you're having the child and what kind of lifestyle in terms of its carbon intensity it will live. So another paper shows that having one extra child in Bangladesh only adds about 56 metric tons of carbon to their parents' carbon legacy over their lifetime, while in comparison, each additional American child adds 9,441 to theirs. And this vast disparity is what leads bioethicists like Travis Ryder to write books like Toward a Small Family Ethic, How Overpopulation and Climate Change Are Affecting the Morality of Procreation, and arguing that it's people like him from nations like this that need to think the hardest about how many kids they have. And of course, cultural perspectives differ greatly, and matter enormously to how we connect to this conversation. Wabgashig Bryce is an Anishinaabe fiction writer dealing with climate change themes, and he reminds us that for his community, climate change is not the end of the world. The end of the world already happened with colonization, with being taken from your families and put into residential schools, with not being allowed to speak your native languages. And so here, when you're visiting a different kind of end of the world, but factoring in the question of children, for him, there's no better time than right now to raise proud Indigenous children, and it's an act of decolonization to do so. And so I just want to bring this into the space of holding multiple truths that I'm sure we'll get deeper into tonight. So, introductions have been made, but we will begin with Mary.
Hi everybody. I'm Mary, Annaïse Heglar, and first I want to say how great it is to be here at ThoughtWorks. My best friend works here. She unfortunately can't be here with us tonight, so I've been to a lot of panels at ThoughtWorks, so it's really cool to be on one. And I'm not going to talk about having children. It's not really my struggle. I'm 35 years old and single, and like having kids looks hard. So it's not really something I'm thinking about. And I'm going to talk about other intimate relationships, starting with the most intimate relationship a person can ever have, which is your relationship with yourself. First of all, I want to say how happy I am to see this conversation about climate change evolving into the emotionality of it, because it's an incredibly emotional experience to look at everything that you hold dear sort of slipping through your fingertips and feeling powerless to stop it, like all of the dimensions that Britt was just mentioning a moment ago. And it's even more heartbreaking to know that we have the solutions at our fingertips, and we have had them for a very long time, but for some reason our decision makers don't really see the preservation of the species and life on Earth as a priority. So it's just such a hard and frustrating experience. When I first got in touch with this reality, I can't tell you how incredibly isolating it was. I went through all of these different stages of grief, and I've written about this a little bit before, that, you know, you go through bargaining of like, oh, it can't be that bad. Oh my God, it's that bad. And just like around and around and around. And then you go through this depression where you feel like you're sort of just floating around, and you don't want to share it with other people because you don't want to really bum them out, and that really affects your friendships, which is another circle of intimate relationships that, especially if you're going to deal with this, you really need. So I'm glad to hear everybody talking about building community around it. It's vital if you're going to survive it. Not only like when it gets real and you need to like rely on your neighbors to keep you alive in a natural disaster, but also just as you cope with this psychologically is really important. And also going through the guilt, because of the way that we generally talk about climate change is about it's your fault because you left the lights on, and the toll that that takes on a person. And so in the beginning, I kind of, not in the beginning, for a really long time, I suffered in silence because everybody else kind of seemed like they were fine. And then eventually I couldn't hold it in anymore, and I realized everyone else was suffering in silence too. And I believe there's a lot of research on that a lot of people are really concerned about climate change, but they don't talk about it to anyone, and they feel even more isolated, even more just like shut down and just kind of in their own little worlds, and that is not healthy at all. So yeah, that really affected my friendships. I would sort of go through these ups and downs of like intense social engagement and intense isolation, and didn't really know how to explain what was going on with me. And probably there's some people I still need to explain that to in my life. It also hangs a really dark cloud over dating, as if dating didn't suck enough already. It's kind of rough to have that sort of like dark cloud hanging over it, and not really knowing how far you can go into like, so do you want to talk about the apocalypse? It's not a really engaging conversation. And not for nothing, you know, nobody really, dating as a straight woman in particular, guys don't like it when you know more about something than they do in general. So like, and then that thing being the apocalypse, it's, you're calling for the check real early. It's an early night. You're not going to be out really long. But honestly, when I think about climate change, the person that I'm most concerned about is not children. It's not mythical grandchildren. It's actually my mother. That's the person I think about the most when I think about climate change. And I think we also need, as we talk about kids, it's important to also remember your parents. And in my case, I'm worried about my mother, not only because she's aging at this point and what happens when she gets flooded, and I know that her hip hurts her a lot on a good day, so what happens when she doesn't have power, and my mom lives in Mississippi, so when the heat goes out, or when the air conditioning goes out, it's a problem, it's an emergency, and I'm really, really worried about her. But also, if you haven't noticed, I'm Black. So I am the first generation in my family that didn't live through Jim Crow. My mother is older than integration. So she told me as a kid, like, we fought these battles so that you wouldn't have to. And now climate change, right? So like, it's like we just got to a point where we have more opportunity, clearly not enough, right? Like we still gotta tell people our lives matter, but it's much different than, like, the Mississippi my mother grew up with is not the Mississippi that I grew up with. And it was supposed to be that, like, I could go live these dreams that she could never live. And now I can't do that. And I also don't feel like I can tell her that much about climate change because I feel like she's been through enough. And the way that that affects our relationship is sort of, I find myself taking on the role of parent more with my mother. I want to protect her from climate change as much as possible, but I also feel powerless to do so. So that was it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mary. Hey, Jade, are you there? Amazing. Cool.
I'm here.
Okay, we can hear you beautifully. Yeah, so now we will give it to Jade to take it away.
Yeah, and I just want to do a quick check on time because I know things have shifted and I just want to make sure I'm sticking within my...
Right, sorry, that's our bad. We started super late compared to what I originally told you, so just feel free to go with whatever you've prepared. It's still the same amount of time you have to talk.
Okay, great. Well, hi everyone. Sorry I can't be there physically, but yeah, you know, speaking of climate change, definitely trying to reduce how much I use jet fuel. So here's me trying to walk that talk. And I'm calling in from Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I'm based, where I'm born and raised. A couple years ago I moved, or actually 3 years ago, I moved back to New Mexico, which is ancestral homeland. I'm indigenous to this part of the world. I'm Diné. Some people say Navajo, but we prefer Diné because Navajo is a colonial name. And yeah, we are reclaiming our own language around who we are. I'm Diné, and I'm also Tesuque Pueblo. So for me, you know, being here on this land is extremely important, especially during these really intense emotional times in our world. You know, I think I've found a lot of relief and healing and nourishment from being on this land, and especially with the work that I do, which is, as Britt mentioned, I work in film, I work in virtual reality and augmented reality, and my focus in those mediums is to create stories around Indigenous issues. So I work with tribes, communities, Indigenous-led organizations from all over the world to communicate their stories. You know, if they're leading different movements to protect land or fight for Indigenous rights, their rights, then that's the story we tell. But yeah, that's kind of my focus area. And I also have a background in communications, strategic communications. So while I help people do creative storytelling work, I also bring in some strategy and advocacy expertise to help uplift and get those stories into places where they can affect, decisions being made and policy. So yeah, I'm often in very frontline type of situations, documenting or working with communities who are experiencing climate change right now or who are preparing. And Britt, when you were going through that slide show or the PowerPoint and talking about all these different impacts psychologically, a lot of them resonated and a lot of them felt really personal because they are working within this world of, I guess, social impact activism. Yeah, there's been a real like secondhand trauma around listening to all of these stories and just also observing and witnessing the constant fight that people are up against. Yeah, there's a lot of that emotional heaviness that comes with this work. And which brings me to, one of the talking points I wanted to explore, which is grief and its role in this type of work, in activism, in organizing. Recently, well, not super recently, but last October, I made the decision to leave my job, which was with the Indigenous Environmental Network. I was working there as a multimedia producer and the communications director. Part of my decision was to leave so that I could focus on creative work, which also has its role in healing. I'm not sure if any of you know of the new book that came out a couple months ago called Pleasure Activism, but there's a whole school of thought out there that we need joy and pleasure in this world, in this era of climate chaos and authoritarian governments, because that's one of the ways we're going to survive and get to the places that we're like envisioning to build. So anyways, I took some time off to focus on some creative work to heal. And in that process, I realized I needed to first grieve. Like, you can't jump into healing before you grieve. And what I ended up grieving during this time I took off from working was everything from work stuff, grieving campaigns that had been lost, grieving legislation that didn't get passed, grieving the Standing Rock movement, which I was tasked with being like one of the lead comms people on the ground. So yeah, there was all of that stuff. And then there was just like this bigger existential grief. And, I've felt that before. I've like I said, kind of as I do this work, it's kind of a constant emotion that's there, but I hadn't really spent a ton of time sitting with it and letting it letting myself process it. So I took some time during the winter, which was a really appropriate time, and just to like really like hibernate and go into my cocoon and grieve, you know, all the things that I know are being lost, you know, from different species to land to people I know's homes. We mentioned, you know, communities in the North who are losing their communities, some of those communities I work with. So yeah, just really being able to cry and let myself really feel those things. That process was like, you know, it's ongoing. It's going to be ongoing forever. But I was really able to like connect with like the power of that. And for me, it really doing that, allowing myself to create and make time for that type of process. And I should mention, I didn't do it alone. I had a lot of community with me to do this work, this grief work, whether it was friends or other colleagues. We just started, you know, finding ways to talk about it. And then eventually we were able to organize a grief retreat later in the winter around February. And we actually gathered at my mentor's land in the Pacific Northwest and held this like really intentional weekend where we grieved together. But what all of this work taught me is that it's really critical to do this work and to demystify and befriend grief. I think society, because of patriarchy, because of all the things, capitalism, we all, we kind of put our quote unquote shadow emotions over in a box or, under the rug. And we say, let's like avoid those because we're too busy, or those emotions are too emotional or whatever. But I think, like I said, befriending these emotions is really what's going to help us continue to get through and do the work that we're here to do clearly. For me, one of the kind of profound things that happened in my grief work was being able to let go of resentment to the Conservative Party, resentment to energy transfer partners who put a pipeline through Standing Rock, that like on these bigger levels, but also resentment to colleagues or resentment to people in my life. And because that was able to be processed through grief work, I feel like I'm doing work from a more clear, centered place. And how great is that? Like, how great is that for, this work that requires like a lot of heart and soul. So
thank you so much for sharing that, Jade. Thank you.
I think there's so much more to say about grief in terms of these questions around bringing life into the world. And I'm so happy you brought up, Britt, this other perspective and a perspective from an Indigenous person on bringing life into this world. I think what you mentioned is valid. I forget the man's name that you mentioned, but I think that's one. And we can't ever say like this is the perspective of all Indigenous people.
Right.
But yeah, I think that is one valid point. And for me, there is like this really strong like duality around. I have that sense of like, my people, especially people here in the desert, like have been really strong and really resilient as far as living in drought and being able to survive in really harsh conditions ecologically. But at the same time, and there's also this like feeling around, I want to be able to carry on culture and language and tradition But, I think there is a real question for me. I'm not a mother. I'm not a mother yet, but, I do have some of those feelings emerging. They're not like super strong right now, but I definitely have some conflict in my heart about what is the right path to
Jade,
take.
I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to stop you there just in the interest
Yeah.
of time. I apologize. I'm so awkward. But thank you very much.
Fine. No, yeah.
Great.
That's why I wanted to check on a time limit.
Okay. Thank you. But please hang out if you would like. We will be checking in on you. Okay. Great. So next we're going to move on to Josephine.
Thank you. I really loved what Jade said about inviting grief. I thought that was a really beautiful turn of phrase. The climate crisis is personal. It's always been personal, and my belief is that we're not able to make meaningful political action until we understand what our personal stakes are. And so I'm representing Conceivable Future, the organization that I founded with Megan Kallman in 2014. But I want to see if I can tell you briefly about that through my own personal sort of intimate experiences. So like a lot of you, I heard about climate change probably when I was like 9 years old or something like that. It came in the context of like Earth Day and putting your trash in the garbage can and stuff like that. And I think I heard about it in an Archie comic for the first time. If not, but that was like the first trauma. Like the Archie comic was so terrifying to me that it just went in there and stayed. And so that was the beginning of this weird era of doublethink, right? Where from that moment on, I was talking about a future with friends and family out in the world that was like, when I go to college, when I get married, when I have, like, all of this stuff was just continuing as ever. And the seed had been planted that things were not going to continue as they always have, but we weren't saying that. In 2011, I had a few radicalizing experiences that brought me out of this like long period of like freaked out denial into like, into an ability to do something, right? And so I went at it with everything I had. I was knocking on doors, I was campaigning I was in the Pacific Northwest at the time. We managed to shut down a bunch of proposals for coal export facilities. And it was a really remarkable experience. My first environmental experience was a win, right? I think anybody who's been doing this work knows that we don't win all that much. So I was kind of high on that, and I started writing and editing climate coverage for Occupy.com, and I did that for quite a few years until in 2014, I moved back to New York to be with my family while my father was dying. And September was the Great Climate March, and the last article that I edited for Occupy was coverage of the march. And it was unbelievably difficult. I just, the collision between my personal familial grief and my larger fears about the world that we were moving toward made that work basically impossible for me. So I stopped that. My father died in October. In November, by really lucky happenstance, I met Megan Kallman. A mutual friend introduced us and said, "You guys do climate work, you should talk to each other." And within 5 minutes, this bizarre conversation was unfolding where I said something like there was a picture on the cover of the New York Times earlier where Obama was shaking hands with Xi Jinping. And I told Megan that the first weird thought that popped into my head when I saw that was like, oh, maybe it would be safe to have a baby. And I was like, what the fuck? And it was the first time I'd said that out loud to anybody. And we've sort of mythologized this conversation. I don't exactly remember what we said then and what happened later, but the power for both of us of saying this stuff to another person was like the doors blew off the hinges. We were I was back into the place I had been before. I had this direct connection to the work and why it was important, and I saw what the work that I needed to do was-ish. So in 2014, no one was talking about this. And in the absence of a robust discussion around this, all this bad stuff was allowed to take root, right? And so for most of us, we have the implicit belief that having a kid is essentially like a bad thing to do for the environment, right? We've been trained to think about it as if this is our personal responsibility, that the biggest thing that we can do for the world is to not reproduce, and then not have a car, and then not fly, that kind of stuff. In the absence of a public conversation, we are not challenging ourselves to ask the question, why is it so goddamn carbon intensive to have a baby in the US in the first place, right? Like, why do we associate having a baby with naive optimism and not having a kid unilaterally with pessimism, right? Like, all of these assumptions were just there. And so Megan and I thought, if other people could have this conversation, and if we could help people have a more fruitful, less judgmental conversation, people would find their own legs. They would find their own ways to connect in a meaningful political way, instead of in this self-defeating personal way, this like winnowing away at your carbon footprint until basically suicide, right? So when we began, we did a lot of kind of like re-education, like remedial, like how do you think about the human rights involved in this conversation? Why is it so easy for us to tell women, especially poor women, and especially women in other countries, what to do with their reproductive lives, and so difficult to tell the fossil fuel industry to stop doing the thing that is killing us? So we did a lot of that, and it's getting easier, and you might have noticed in the past year or so that conversations really started to come into the public headspace. That's not necessarily a good thing, right? It would be cool if we didn't have to have this conversation so much. Like, the work is never, successes for us are not always like successes for the world, right? So I want to say a little bit about why we organize the way that we do. Because there's two of us, and not myself, I'm not much of an organizer. Megan is a grant writer like you wouldn't believe, and she secured funding for like 10 projects while we were looking for funding for Conceivable Future, like, and nothing for Conceivable Future. It was really taboo. It was really untouchable for a while. I think we'd have different luck if we tried now, but we wanted to come up with a plan that was like endlessly reproducible, very cheap, could suit the needs of whatever community wanted to use the tools we had to offer. So anyone can organize a house party, and a house party could be 3 people sitting in a living room. It could be this many people in this kind of room. But it's, how do you facilitate this conversation in a community that already exists, that needs to dig a little deeper, that needs to stake their own claim? So we help people organize these events, and the other thing that we do is we gather testimonies from participants. And a testimony is your own spoken truth about your experience. How has climate change shaped your reproductive life? It's not, I'm swearing I'm never gonna have babies. It's not, I'm gonna fight like for the kids that I have. It's whatever the truth is for you. How is this manifesting in your life? And so, like, on the largest level, it's a website that has some people talking about this stuff. But it's on the grassroots level that I think this is really effective. Because if you make a testimony, or you make a testimony, and you put it online, we invite you to share it with 3 people that are important to you in your life. Whether it's a parent, a faith leader, people that you know, but you haven't said this with. It's a way of drawing people into the heart of the matter, right? Drawing people into the conversation about why is this so important? And that's not because of kids or not because of kids. It's like, this is intimate. This is shaping every day of the future of my life. So having said that, I want to invite you all to come and talk to me if this interests you, if you want to host your own house party, if you'd like to testify, or if you just want to talk. All right, thanks so much.
Speaking of which, I'm so sorry, I skipped over applauding Jade. Can we all applaud Jade? Jade, if you're there.
I wrote some stuff down because I'm used to like just rambling for an hour, and I did not really trust myself to be concise. So I didn't want to waste people's time too much. Like Mary and Josephine, I became aware of the gravity of climate change, sort of not intellectually, but emotionally, a while ago, I think around 10 years ago, while I was doing research for my first book. And I guess I went through some of the sort of emotional odyssey that people are describing a little bit earlier than maybe some folks who are going through it now. And so I'll admit that I find myself a little bit numb sometimes. And I think that's a coping mechanism. It's sort of how I've been able to do the work that I do, which is teaching and writing about climate change for the last 10 years, without really being emotionally overwhelmed or sort of breaking down and just giving up, which is always sort of like something that is a possibility, as I'm sure some folks know. But definitely being here and sort of listening to the other speakers is bringing a lot of those emotions back in a way that I think is really healthy. And so I really appreciate being here, and thanks to Britt and everyone else for organizing this. So as Britt mentioned, I'm a professor of environmental studies. And last year I conducted the first social scientific study on people that are connecting climate change to their reproductive choices. This was a survey of 1,000 people of childbearing age, which is sort of around 20 to 45. And it was largely focused on the US, so 800 Americans out of 1,000 people total. And like the folks that Josephine works with, these people really ran the spectrum from people who have 5 kids, 5 kids, yeah, to people who had vasectomies and tubal ligations out of love and concern for their hypothetical children. So this was an unusually intimate and detailed survey. The average person took about 45 minutes to fill it out. And so I've spent the last few months sort of swimming through a massive amount of data, the sort of often anguished climate narratives of 1,000 people. But Britt asked me to surface and contribute something today. So I thought I would make 3 quick points based on my research. And just to be clear, the book that I'm writing isn't a polemic. It's not sort of trying to tell people that they should do one thing or another, but is really sort of trying to take a sociological journey through the ethics and politics of reproductive choices in the age of climate change, as well as a guide for people who are considering its central question, because I think that's something that a lot of folks could really use. And for anyone who's interested, it'll probably be out in 2020. So the first of the 3 points is that there are a lot of people that are connecting climate change to their reproductive choices. So it's only in the last, really the last year or so, that this is getting the sort of widespread attention it deserves, that people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Miley Cyrus are sort of talking about it publicly. But I calculate that in 2018, when I did the survey, over 2.5 million Americans of childbearing age who did not already have children were putting off becoming parents, partially because of their climate concerns. Well, 2.5 million. That's obviously a massive number, but it doesn't include everyone. So for example, it doesn't include the parents that are having fewer children than they would desire because of their climate concerns. And that larger number, which I can't really calculate for various reasons, doesn't include people outside the US. And so obviously climate concern in some ways is more widespread outside the US. The rest of the world does not have the Republican Party, thank God. But so the US is only 5% of the global population, and a 2018 poll found a similar level of eco-reproductive concern among Australians, for example. And so there's little reason to doubt that this sort of climate-caused reproductive reluctance is shared by tens of millions of young people throughout the world. So for those of you that are sort of in that place, it goes without saying that you're not alone. A second point is that it's really good to talk, both psychologically and I would say politically. Conversations about this issue are definitely becoming more frequent, but they're still relatively rare. So while a few of my respondents reported discussing this decision all the time, as they put it, many people hadn't spoken to anyone at all, or had had sort of 1 or 2 conversations with 1 or 2 friends. Conversations about making babies as the climate changes can be difficult, they can be anxious, they can be uncomfortable, but they can also be deeply comforting, as perhaps some people are sort of starting to see today. They can be rewarding and they can be illuminating. They can also be life-altering. So a lot of the people who took my survey sort of described particular conversations that they had with friends that were particularly meaningful. And so as a 37-year-old woman who took my survey wrote, everyone benefits from having more than one template for a life well lived. And so, from my perspective, these are really the kinds of conversations that matter. So the absence of conversation about having children in the age of climate change is part of the broader spiral of silence that communication scholars have described around climate change. And it goes without saying that if we can't talk about climate change, we're never going to respond to it, let alone respond to it in the way that this moment demands. I wouldn't go overboard and say that talking is the most important thing you can do in response to climate change, but I don't think that's true. But it is really valuable. And I think who you talk to matters also. So one thing you might do after this event, for example, is to call your parents. Being back in New York City, where I grew up, I went to high school about 10 blocks away from here, is reminding me of the generational gulf in perceptions of climate change, which was a huge issue for almost all of my respondents. Most baby boomers came of age thinking that caring about the environment was optional. It was something that you could do or not do, sort of like knitting or golf or some other kind of hobby. And so it seems difficult, I think, for them to accept the centrality of environmental concerns to life today and to whatever future awaits. Given that so many old folks vote, and some of them have a lot of money to donate, I can't help but hope that some candid conversations with their children or grandchildren, maybe some of you know Nancy Pelosi's grandchildren, perhaps? Anyone in the room? I can't help but think that this would make some kind of small difference, that conversations about the anxiety and even the hopelessness that a lot of people are feeling, the necessity of change, the necessity of revolution today, and the way that current US politics are exacerbating a lot of the psychological consequences of climate change. So finally, the last point, while this eco-reproductive concern is not new, I'm sad to say that it isn't fleeting. Like climate change itself, it will only spread and deepen. We have some idea how much chaos is baked into the climatic system, so we know that things will be bad no matter what we do now. The question is how bad it'll get, and for how long. The question is what kinds of choices our children or the children of our friends or family members will be facing in the future. And as you know, a lot of that depends on what folks do in the next 10 years. There are so many ways that one could view this issue. History, psychology, and ethics are the ones that I'm considering in the book that I'm writing. But as I consider it for myself, since that's really what motivates my research, that's why I got interested in the subject in the first place, as I consider it for myself, I always come back to politics. How can I do the most at this historical moment in which the future of the world literally hinges on what we do? In that spirit, I hope that this panel and the conversations that follow are interesting, are comforting, and are helpful no matter what stage you find yourselves in today. But I hope that it will lead to both solidarity and rage, as one of my respondents put it. I hope that you get a sense of solidarity out of being here, but also to take some rage with you. To rage at the fact that we're in this position 30 years after climate change became a matter of public concern. Rage that we've somehow constructed a world in which people can think that having children would be a cruel act. And also rage that for many it seems impossible to live in the US today without being part of the problem. Because rage, instead of sadness, anxiety, or depression, which I'm sure many of you have experienced, as have I, rage is the kind of emotion that can fuel meaningful action. And whether you have children or not, action is what matters most. Thanks.
Wow, beautiful wrap up. Thank you so much to each of our panelists, Mary, Jade, Josephine, Matthew. So much to think about. We're going to bring that with us now into this workshop component.